Well, hello and welcome back. Thank you for joining us for another one of our interview series. Today we have with us Nancy Smith, who's a family law lawyer in Williston, Vermont in the USA, who practices in both Vermont and New York. She's been in practice since 1992 and represents parents, spouses, and children in the divorce process, both in court and in out-of-court resolution processes like divorce mediation and collaborative divorce. Welcome, Nancy.
Hello, thank you, Stephanie.
So in Nancy's practice, she encourages families to create a divorce narrative. And that's what we're here to talk about today is what is that divorce narrative and why might it be important? So she's here to talk about why that can actually help to create a positive and distinct future for families. So let's get started. What is a divorce narrative, Nancy, and why is this important?
Thank you, Stephanie. All right, so a divorce narrative is just a story. We all tell ourselves stories all the time. And when a divorce is upon us, it's very easy to get locked into a story that's pretty negative and self-reinforcing, and frankly starts to become a bit of confirmatory bias, which is just starting to believe that everything that happens just fits your preconceived notion of how you expected it to be. And that becomes a pretty bit, it can become a bit of a rabbit hole. So I think it's important because, like Gandhi said, your beliefs become your thoughts become your words become your actions become your habits become your values, and your values become your destiny. So just from the power of your thoughts, you're going to create your destiny. And so I just want to encourage people to lift their eyes up above the horizon a little bit, even if it feels very dark and scary at the moment when you first embark upon a divorce. There is an opportunity to recreate your divorce story, and that's good for you. It might work for your spouse, it may not. It's an individual thing, or it could be a collective discussion, and we can talk about that, how we do that in a collaborative divorce. It's definitely part of our process because we know how important it is that children in particular and the extended family get the same message from the couple, who then can declare to the universe and their friends, their family, and their children how they intend to be divorced, so that their ultimate resolution and their outcome and their future can be healthy and wholehearted instead of bitter and resentful.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to interject by saying, when you talked about changing thoughts and how that impacts someone, for the past 15 years in my practice, I've had one single wall decal. And actually, I'm just going to move my head, and it says right here, change your thoughts and change your world. And I saw that when I very first started practicing and helping families, and that has stuck with me, and I've never changed that wall decal in 15 or 16 years. And so that's very true. That's very true.
So you speak my language, Stephanie. Yes, that's true. It is true. And our thoughts are so powerful. And, when a couple separates, there's usually, good reasons. But at the heart of it, it's often just ineffective communication about individual needs. And often there's a feeling of a lack of trust or accountability, and people are afraid of saying what they truly feel or think out of fear of hurting somebody else's feelings, or just people-pleasing behaviors, or just not even taking the time to know what you truly want. And so I definitely encourage clients at the time of a divorce to take some time and start to monitor your thoughts, especially thoughts that might be self-deprecating. We don't want those. We want to start feeling empowered and confident as we move forward. And even when we start thinking about our spouse, it's really important not to just keep affirming all the negative, because then you're just going to keep seeing the negative everywhere.
And one analogy that I give to my clients is, thinking about a highway going down a long road, and, on either side, you've got a ditch, and the ditch is the negative, and the ditch is the downtrodden and the past, and the road ahead is your future, and it's your positive thoughts. And if you continue to look into the ditch, eventually you're going to go into the ditch. And so what we want is to help you to learn the tools to stay on that road and stay focused on that end goal, which for a lot of families is, a positive future, a bright future, and what that looks like. So it starts with the divorce narrative. And I know, Nancy, that in your practice, you encourage people to do this right from the very beginning. And so why don't we go into the components of what the heck is a divorce narrative and what does it actually look like? So there's two different aspects that we'll go into today. One is the parent's divorce story or the parent's divorce narrative, and one is the children's story. So let's start with the parent story, and if you can touch on that a little bit.
Sure. So it came about in our collaborative divorce practices where, well, for me, it came about in a highly contested adversarial case where I just kept noticing that my client would not change the way he thought. Like there was nothing that could be done or said that would change his narrative. And I saw how destructive that was. Mm-hmm. And then when I start working in the collaborative space where we have a mental health coach and we have another lawyer, we started talking about how to frame the divorce before you tell the children. And what we've found is that oftentimes there's so much fear and anxiety and tension when people just start to begin their divorce process. So there's also a sense of grief and loss, right? Because you lose your best friend and your lover and your role in the family and your identity in the marriage and a portion of your time with your children and a portion of your wealth and your income and your savings and retirement. And often like the loss of your dream is really the one thing that hurts the most. So there's a lot of pain in a divorce, even when you know that it's the right thing to do, even when you feel like you're at acceptance, it's still a loss. And so I think we're all mindful of that. That's a bit of a grieving process. And it's easy to fall prey to like the easiest emotion, which is like anger. And if you stay in that anger, it feels easier to like hate your spouse and than it is to just say you love them and you just can't live with them. And it takes courage, I think, to lead with love. And so if you can lead with love, and this is not kumbaya stuff.
And it's not in love, it's love as an emotion, which is important distinction. Mm-hmm.
It is. I appreciate that. And it is. It's not in love. It's just that you can honor your past. You can honor them as a human being, as the spouse as your former spouse and the parent of your children. Like that's got to count for something. And if you could, lead with love, mutual respect, and having an expectation that you both want to emerge healthy and wholehearted, then couples have an opportunity to set the tone for their divorce. And from the moment that they decide to choose a divorce with some degree of dignity, and regardless of what process you use, whether it's mediation or do it yourself, this is still an exercise that's worthy of contemplation, because especially when you want to be friends afterwards and you want to have an amicable divorce, it doesn't mean that things won't get tough. It doesn't mean that the negotiations might not get sticky, that there are things that you don't agree on, and that is okay. People can disagree and have different perceptions of a situation, but it doesn't make you the enemy, right? And so
those difficult conversations are part of the uncoupling process and part of untying that knot, and you can't get away from that. But at the end of the day, once those difficult conversations have happened, you've got a certain result, which we hope can be more one of, positive and future focused.
Absolutely. And so like, this is your time, this is your opportunity to make a conscious decision about how do you intend to move forward? How are you going to demonstrate by your words and your actions, your own core values for yourself, for your children, for the extended family and the friends and community? So without a shared narrative, it's very easy to just default to your individual narrative that's kind of steeped in victimization and blame and shame. So we try to elevate the conversation and say, what is it going to look like? And it should be short. But when we're talking about it with respect to how to tell the children or the extended family, we want it to be something like, and the clients can generate this on their own. And we ask them to do that as an exercise and then come share it with us and talk about what would make sense and how to choreograph how to tell the children. And it's particularly effective in that context because everybody's scared and nobody wants the other person to tell the kids first or to set the narrative like, oh, we're getting divorced because your mother had an affair, or we're getting divorced because your father's an alcoholic. Like, we don't want to do that. That's not healthy. It's not helpful. So we can come together, and those things may have been true, but as a couple, you can say, we have decided to separate. We love each other. We still love each other. We love you guys, the kids. We want to be better friends, and we think we'll be better friends than a married couple. Like, as simple as that. It's like a simple, a simple narrative. And then you explain that to your other important people in your life that the kids are likely to go talk to, either older siblings or step siblings or your favorite sister or brother, because they're all going to get a little curious depending on how old the children are and where they are in their process developmentally. But they're going to be checking on your narrative. So you want your people to all know the narrative so that, and your best friend, oh, did you hear mom and dad are divorcing? And a grandparent says, yes, I heard they really love each other, but they'd rather be, they think they're going to be better friends than a married couple. And then everybody just kind of leaves it at that, and you normalize it. And then the kids won't be so fraught and concerned about being pulled apart and twisting, separating loyalties and things like that.
And it's sort of a bit of an elevator speech of sorts, right? It's the few sentences worth of exactly, what the message is. It's a consistent and common message that you want to be putting out there to the world, putting out there to your children, putting out there to everyone, because people are going to randomly ask you as they find out that you're separating, or as you tell them that you're separating, they're going to randomly ask you, how are you doing? Or what happened, or what's going, they'll be asking you various questions depending on your relationship with them. And so you want to be in a position to be able to go forward with that common message. Now, one of the interesting things, Nancy, you were talking about doing this within the context of mediation or the collaborative divorce process, but you also talked about this client that you had that was in the highly contested adversarial process. And so if you can talk a little bit about the differences when you would be doing this as a together project or a together story versus the ability to still create that narrative, even if your former spouse isn't on the same page with you, or maybe you have different narratives and you can't actually create one together because of the situation.
Right. So first choice is always to create a common narrative for exactly the reasons you said. There are so many people that are so nosy about all of your business, and not that anybody needs to know, but if they need to know something and you need to say something, a short little pithy, we've decided to be better friends than a married couple. And that's all they need to know. And you don't have to feel compelled to explain your story to anybody. So I just want people to feel comfortable setting a reasonable boundary about that. Because you're so right. And especially in small towns, people want to know your business. But it is an option for regardless of whether your spouse can create a common narrative. But let me just back up just 1 second. In addition to the narrative, when you do a common one, we choreograph when we're going to tell the kids, who's going to speak first. We try to have the couple, exactly like you said, practice their elevator speech, practice it ahead of time. Who's going to lead the conversation? What are you going to do for an activity afterwards? Because oftentimes the children may not have a very strong reaction right away, but they might think about it later on, and maybe that evening and over the next couple of weeks, questions are going to pop up, and you want to be able to go back to your mantra, which is, you don't give them too much information. You don't need to tell them the truth of everything. Your truth may not be the same as your spouse's truth. So come together on your narrative, right? Just come together on your narrative and just say the same things. And then eventually they'll stop asking, or they'll believe you. And then you'll believe yourself, because the more you say it, the more you're going to believe it to be true as well, even though you might have your lingering doubts and your skepticism and other things like that. But when it comes to your other spouse and you're in a litigation situation and there's no way you're going to get the same narrative, that's unfortunate, but that does happen. But just because that happens doesn't mean that you shouldn't take the opportunity to create your new narrative so that you feel good about yourself, right? And you set the narrative, you set the tone. Of course, we don't have control over what other people do and what our ex-spouses do or say, but you have complete control over what comes out of your mouth and what thoughts you're thinking. And so that's,
it can also wear off on others. So if you continue to talk, use this narrative, you're going to talk to the kid, you're going to tell this narrative to the kids. Again, it's a positive message. It's not too much. It's got boundaries on it. You're going to give it to the kids. You're going to give it to all of your surrounding people who may actually be similar people to your former spouse. And then they're going to hear that narrative. And when they hear that narrative and then they talk to your spouse, and in different contexts and not from a nosiness standpoint, but just generally talking to your spouse, they'll hear a different narrative and say, that's not what your spouse said. And so that can also help to shape your spouse, even though you're not actually coming to agreement on it. Your spouse is still able to hear that narrative in various scenarios.
Yeah, that would be a wonderful opportunity, sort of by osmosis, your spouse gets it.
Yes.
Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
So even if they don't, that should
Can't
not
control it.
discourage you, right?
Yeah.
Don't let your spouse's behavior discourage you
Yeah.
from taking the high road and setting
Mhm.
yourself up for success and the healthy, wholehearted life that you want to have.
Yeah.
And the relationship that you want to have with your children. Because it's so important that the children not feel that they're being split in their loyalties. Because of course, we all know, children are a part of both of the parents. And if you start to, demean or denigrate or put down another parent, the child experiences that as putting down half of themselves. And that leads to a whole host of potential problems that I'm sure you've had other people on to talk about.
Yeah.
But we don't need to do that. So right now we're just focused on our own attitudes, our beliefs, our actions, our thoughts, and the words that we use to describe why we're getting divorced. That's the divorce narrative.
Yeah. And, what we're talking about in today's interview for our viewers, we're wanting to give people an idea of what the heck is a divorce narrative, just introducing the topic. And Nancy, you've given some good examples, and we're going to talk in a moment here about children's divorce narratives. But as far as the actual meat of how do you create a narrative and what are the components of it, there's lots of information out there as far as, you might want to research a little bit is what do you want your narrative to be? Because it has to be something that speaks to you. It's your elevator speech. It's your narrative of your story, your divorce story, but also your narrative going forward, and how you're gonna look at that. So I encourage all of our viewers to, do your own contemplation as far as what components will work for you, because it is an individual thing.
Definitely, that's great advice, and taking the time to really look within at this time. It's an opportunity. It's a weird gift, divorce sometimes, and I think you got to use it as an opportunity to improve yourself, to get to know yourself, to understand your true values and what's going to be important for you to be able to express. And then I also think, to add to that, Stephanie, you want somebody to review your narrative before you start sharing it. Like have a trusted advisor, either your lawyer, your collaborative lawyer, or your counselor or a divorce coach. Have somebody double check you, because you might think that it's really awesome and right on what you want to say, but somebody else might have some feedback that could be helpful to you to avoid potentially something that you might not have intended it that way.
Yeah, very interesting. Let's move on, Nancy, to the children's divorce story, which of course parents will help to create and coach. And before we started here today, you gave me a great example to lead off this conversation.
Yeah, sure. So sometimes what we say to people is, and when we're having the conversation about the divorce narrative and how important it is, we're always trying to keep the children foremost in our minds when we're going through the divorce, because that tends to help alleviate some of the negativity between the spouses. So we say, imagine it's a few years down the road and you're in a position to overhear your child talking on the playground to another child whose friend kind of looks sad and a little distraught because that child's parents are going to just announce that they're going to be getting divorced. And your child, with great empathy and conviction, offers comfort to his friend and tells him it's going to be okay. Both of his parents love him. Both of his parents will keep him out of the middle of their fights. Having two homes it's fine. It works out okay. You get to spend great time with one parent and great time with the other parent, and you get your parents' undivided attention, and they're not fighting anymore. So, both your parents love and support me, and I get to love each of them, and I don't have to choose between them. Mm-hmm. And that often allows the parents to just sit back and say, yeah, I would love my son or daughter to be able to impart that kind of support to another child. And that will happen by your own behaviors during your divorce. So if you follow your values and act in conformity with them throughout your divorce, your children are going to watch you like a hawk throughout the entire process. So if you can assure him or her of these things, like whatever it is that's in your divorce narrative, whatever you impart to your children is what they're going to impart to their friends and other people when the circumstances comes back down the road, because it does. It's just a very common experience nowadays. So.
Yeah. And for your children to be able to have the ability to explain their story, which is the narrative of where they're at right now and how it came to be. We live in two different homes, and mommy and daddy don't fight anymore. And as you said, we get to have their undivided attention, or whatever that might look like, is helping your child to lead by you can lead by example, is to share that your story with the children, and that will impart onto them.
Exactly. So that's kind of how we use divorce narratives in my practice.
So what have you what kind of impact have you found that your clients have had when they create this divorce narrative?
So we've had quite a bit of feedback, and clients really appreciate it because they felt pretty groundless and rudderless at the beginning, and they didn't really have a good, clear path on how they were going to explain it to the kids. And if left to their own devices, they would have gone with their traditional narrative, of their negative narrative of blame and shame, because it's just more natural, and they're still hurt and wounded. So when they have the opportunity to set it up in a better way, we found that the children do well, that we have a follow-up meeting and we check in and say, hey, how did it go? And it went according to plan. There was a few tears, maybe there was no tears, but we had an activity to do afterwards. We both feel confident with the narrative, and that we feel confident that the other parent, when asked a difficult question, that the parents are going to defer it and say, that's an adult conversation, or that's not really part of, it's nothing that's between my mother and you, my mom and you, or me, or whatever you'd say, that's not really your business to tell the kids in a nice way that it's not their business. When they start probing, because they're so curious and they always want to probe deeper. But I've had clients come back and say, we just say, that's between mom and dad, and we're going to work it out, and we're doing our best, and we're in a process, and we'll let you know. We'll keep you up to date when things are coming up that you need to know about. But so it's nice to be able to tell them, kids like to know, they like consistency and structure and reliability. And so when their lives are changing and you announce a divorce, it's super disruptive to them too. So to the extent you and your spouse can be on the same page, use common language, it alleviates their stress and anxiety. It makes them healthier, more capable of just getting on with their own lives and not being overwhelmed by all the emotion and tension and your worries and concerns, because you don't have to worry anymore. You've got the narrative laid out. You can trust the other person to respond appropriately, and then it takes one thing off of your plate of worry, I think.
Absolutely. So I want to go into my very favorite part of every interview, which is my top 3 tips. So what I'd like to know and have you explain to our viewers is your top 3 tips for families who are looking to create their divorce narrative.
Okay, so number 1 is be curious about why your spouse is acting a certain way. Don't assume you know. So my number 1 is watch for your confirmatory bias. I really think that's really important. It's just so easy to just judge everything that your spouse does under the lens of, yep, of course she's doing that. I expected that. Or, yep, I knew he would do that, because you think you know why they're doing it. But I would ask that you be curious about why they're actually doing it. And now is an opportunity to watch for your confirmatory bias. Number 2 is choreograph how to tell the children, even adult children, about the divorce. The when, the where, the how, the language, who's going first. Think about it. Put some effort into it. Choreograph the narrative. And then number 3, the most important, is stick to it.
The hardest one, probably the hardest one.
It is the hardest one. You have to stick to the narrative, even when it's tough, even when you're like, oh my God, no, I can't say this again. I don't even believe it. But you have to act as if you believe it. You have to stick to the narrative, even when it's tough. So those would be my top 3.
And again, because your thoughts become your world, right?
Exactly.
And
your
become
destiny.
your actions become your, exactly. That was a great quote. Okay, well, before we wrap up, was there anything more that you wanted to add?
I feel like we've covered so much, and I think it's just a great opportunity and thank you for the opportunity, Stephanie, and just allow people an opportunity to do something different. Like, just start thinking outside of the box a little bit. You have choices. You have different ways of doing things. This is not your parents' divorce anymore. We're in the modern world. You can do it however you want to, right? And do what works for you. And like Stephanie said, like, find your authentic voice And whether or not your spouse wants to get in, if you're doing it collaboratively, then great. You can certainly do it together. But even if your spouse doesn't want to, you do it because you know it's the right thing to do.
No, that's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Nancy. And of course, there's lots of great resources for our viewers. You can check out some of our other interviews, our ebooks, blogs, our book club, and of course, we've got our course library. So thank you very much for joining us. And Nancy, thanks again for coming.
Of course, thank you so much.